Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our sermon introduction today, our Sunday introduction today, if you're watching this on Sunday, March the 6th. You know, it's kind of strange because this is our next to our last week here. It's my next to my last sermon. And my first sermon in Fairfax was on March the 6th, 2011. And so it is right at 11 years. We didn't come to the church for a couple of months after this. Back in that, but it was just a preliminary day for the church to kind of get to know me and to get a feel for my style and everything, without knowing that I might be the candidate. And so 2 weeks after, I came back to preach and to be interviewed, and then about a month later, I came in view of a call and been 11 years since. So anyway, but this week is not about me, but it is about what God did. It's about what God has done in me and through me, hopefully, and what He will continue to do, not because I'm Andy Braams, but because He's God. And that is a part of our message this week. And so, as you're preparing for this message, if you want to turn to 2 Kings chapter 2, that's where we're going to begin today. But the idea is that God can take anybody. And as we've seen in this series, He's taking a nobody like Fairfax or like Paul's sister's nephew, again, son, Paul's sister's son. As I said, he doesn't even get the moniker of Paul's nephew. He's mentioned third hand. We looked at Hannah and Huldah. We've looked at the demoniac. We've looked at Zebedee and at Salome, his wife. We've looked at Jesse, and we've looked at just so many different people in this particular series. And today we look at somebody who's not an unsung hero, because God chose that. And so just like He's chosen me to be the pastor of this church for 11 years, I'm not known by anybody. I mean, maybe there's a few people who watch these videos regularly. Great. Nobody knows Andy Braams. Nobody might know Andy Braams in 100 years. How many people will know me in 100 years? It's up to God. And it's not my call to be known. My call is to serve. So is yours. And so we're going to see that today. Now, this week is our last full week of ministry in Fairfax. So next Sunday will be my last sermon. And this coming week, we will have the regular daily videos, and they're normally discipleship videos, and I'll talk a little bit about where those came, how those evolved over the past couple of years since we started them. This week is going to be a reflection. They're not going to be discipleship in the fact that we're not going to talk about the Bible per se, but we can do discipleship by encouraging others, by helping others to be involved in ministry. So part of what I want to do in tomorrow's video is reflect on our time here, some of the highlights and some of the fun things that have happened in our time here. And then on Wednesday, in the last of what will be our daily discipleship videos, the last one that we record, it will be a little bit about my hope for the future for Fairfax, and specifically on one particular thing, I should say. So that we will have those two. We will have a Friday preview next week or this coming Friday for the last Friday preview, and then we will have one more sermon as we say farewell, at least for now. And I don't mean that we're returning. That's not what that means, but it'll make more sense in next week's sermon. So that is what is upcoming this week. As always, I encourage you to give, to be a part of the giving ministry of Fairfax Baptist Church, and you can do that through the mail, as I say each week, P.O. Box 350, Fairfax, Missouri 64446, and or online at fairfaxbaptistchurch.org. And you can either do /give or click the give button and give securely, set up recurring giving, whatever you want to do in that way. So I hope that you can be a part of the ministry in that way. I hope that you will be involved in other parts of the ministry, praying for the ministry, praying for this church as we prepare to depart ourselves, and we will continue to pray for the ministry of Fairfax Baptist, because this is indeed a part of us. It's a part of our family. It is our family in so many ways. So with that, let's look at the last of this series on Unsung Heroes by looking at someone, Elisha, who again wasn't necessarily an unsung hero, but that's only because God made it so. We began this short series back in early January by looking at some of the most well-known names of the Bible, at least me mentioning some of those well-known names of the Bible. People, somewhat chronologically at least, like Noah and Abraham, and we could talk about Isaac, we could talk about Jacob, we could talk about Joseph, we could talk about Moses, we could talk about Joshua, or Samuel, or David, or Elijah, or Daniel, just all these people from the Old Testament, and then Elizabeth and Mary, and obviously Jesus, but Peter and James and John and Paul, and just, again, so many different names. And those names are well known. Those are indeed heroes of the Bible, within the Bible. They are also heroes, as we might say, within the faith. Heroes of the faith. Those people that I just mentioned are extraordinary people within the Bible. Their names, although they lived some 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, their names are still very common today. That shows just the kind of hero that they are. But this series has not been about those heroes. This series has been about people who have been behind the scenes, people who may not be as well known, people that are relatively unknown to most people or completely unknown even to people who have been Christians for many years. People like Hathach, for instance, from Esther. Hathach helping Mordecai and Esther. Those two names we know. Who is Hathach? We saw the role of Paul's sister's son, his nephew, that saved Paul's life. We looked at the response of a man who was possessed by thousands of demons, whom after he was healed was obedient to Jesus, and presumably, as I made the argument a couple of weeks ago, presumably led thousands of people to be prepared to follow Jesus at a later point. We reviewed the faith of two women, Hannah and Huldah, and how each of them had a role to play in the lives of two young men, one being Hannah's son Samuel, the other being the king of Israel, the young king of Israel, Josiah, and each of those two greatly impacting Israel. The young men growing, impacting Israel, but in part because of the role that these two women played. We looked at the role of family with imparting of the faith to Timothy by Lois and Eunice. We looked at how Jesse may have had an specific impact on David. We looked at how Zebedee and Salome had an impact on James and John. And so the people of this series are far lesser known than most people. Truly unknown by many people. But, as I have argued, as I have presented the case, these people are heroes as well. They may not have been extraordinary, at least as the world thinks of it, but they were significant in their role, and therefore they should be considered heroes within the Bible, heroes of the faith, and that is why this series has been called Unsung Heroes. But this series began a couple of months ago with a story about a farmer. A man who was tending the field for his parents with 12 yoke of oxen, 24 oxen. He may have had greater aspirations than being a farmer. He may not have. We don't know anything about it. But his life changed dramatically when he chose to follow someone who was closely following God. The man whose life was changed was Elisha. The man whom he followed was Elijah. The one who made it possible, God. Again, Elisha was tending to his field. Elijah had been told by God to go find Elisha, and he did. And after this brief paragraph in 1 Kings chapter 19 that describes Elisha, what he was doing in the field, and then following Elijah, we really don't have anything for the next few pages in 1 Kings. We pick up the story in 2 Kings. Specifically, today we are looking at 2 Kings chapter 2. Now, what we can surmise during this time period, even though we don't know exactly how long it was, what we can surmise is that Elisha had been an apprentice to Elijah. And therefore, during this time, there was probably several things that he observed in watching Elijah, even though we don't have anything describing it in those final pages of 1 Kings. So why do I say that? Why do I say that there was probably many things that happened? Well, when the time of Elijah's departure was near, Elisha went across the Jordan with him. And when Elijah asked what he could do for Elisha, Elisha's response was that he wanted to receive a double blessing, a double portion of the Spirit that was on Elijah. Now that's a bold request. Because again, Elijah, wow, I mean, he was the one that brought a boy back from the dead. He was the one who defeated the prophets of Baal up on Mount Carmel. But what Elijah knew is that he did not have the power, he did not have the authority to grant such a request. So listen to the response that Elijah gave to Elisha. I'm in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 10. And he, meaning Elijah, said, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." So what happened? Verses 11 and 12. And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it. He saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And he saw him no more. Now remember, Elisha had asked for this double portion of Spirit, and Elijah responded, "If you see when I depart, it will be so for you." And verse 12 said, and Elisha saw it. He saw it, and thus he was changed. Immediately, he picks up Elijah's cloak. He went to the water's edge, and following the example that he had just seen Elijah do as they had crossed the Jordan one direction, he's now going the other direction, and he strikes the cloak, and the water parted, and he is able to walk through. Verse 14. Now, I'm going to come back to this passage in a couple of moments, but first what I want to do is I want to show you what this allowed for Elisha to do as a part of his ministry. I'm not sharing these things to suggest that you and I will be able to do these things. Again, the role here is that we play our part, but God's role is ultimately what is key. So I'm going to do this pretty rapidly, but the passages for each of these verses and such will be in the notes that you can download and see in that way. So in the remainder of this chapter, in the remainder of chapter 2, Elisha heals the water. He makes the water good. Later he curses some boy. I love this part of the story. It says that these small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." They were calling him Baldy. And so in the name of God, not using the Lord's name in vain, that's not what this is saying, but in the name of God, he cursed them, and God sent 2 female bears, and, well, let's just say the taunting ended at that point. In chapter 3, Elisha gives counsel to the king. In chapter 4, he helps a widow, and we find this widow returning in the story a couple more times. He helps a widow turn a small amount of oil into a surplus. I'm sorry, this is a different widow, a different woman. But he helps this widow turn a small amount of oil into a surplus so that she can pay off her debts and keep her sons from having to be sold into slavery to pay those debts. Then, that's in verses 1 through 7. Then in verses 8 through 17, here's the woman I was speaking of a moment ago, not a widow. he gave hope to this woman that she would have a son 1 year later. Then in verse 18, the story continues several years after that, and Elisha has to come back to raise the boy from the dead. The chapter then ends with Elisha healing a pot of stew which had been inadvertently poisoned with some plants from the field that no one knew to check. And then he multiplies bread for those who had gathered around. Kind of sounds like a familiar story of multiplying bread and fishes. Here, there were 20 loaves of bread, and loaves were very small. A loaf would barely feed one person, but a loaf of bread with 20 loaves of bread with at least 100 people. In chapter 5, Elisha heals the commander of a foreign army. And interestingly, we're talking about unsung heroes. Rick called me not that long ago and said, hey, what about Naaman? What about the story of Naaman? What about the unsung heroes like the little slave girl, the little girl who was taken as a slave, or even the wife? Those are both unsung heroes in this story as well. Just don't have time to unpack that, but you can read about both of them in verse 2 and 3 of chapter 5. Just a brief sentence, but unsung heroes. You'll find unsung heroes throughout the Bible if you look closely. So then we move to chapter 6, and there was a story of a man. It begins with the story of a man who borrowed an axe. And as he was felling the wood, as he was chopping down trees, the axe head dislodged from the handle, and it went into the stream there. And as it went into the stream, because he had borrowed the axe, he was distraught. And Elisha made the heavy metal of the axe head rise up in the water so that it could be retrieved. Then, in verse 8, same chapter, Elisha tried to comfort the king of Syria as the king as Syria threatened war, because Elisha understood that the armies of God, even though they were invisible to everyone else, one person eventually got to see them, but the armies of God were there to thwart the enemy and to protect Israel. In chapter 7, Elisha predicts the end of a famine, and I preached on that sermon just a couple of years ago. In 2 Kings 8, Elisha's actions are remembered by the king, which allows that woman, that Shunammite woman that had the son, she was able to have her land restored to her because the king wanted to show favor to Elisha. Then in verse 7, he foretells the death of the Syrian king. Jumping to chapter 9, God had Elisha prepare Jehu to be the next king. And then in chapter 13, we arrive at the end of Elisha's life. Now, as a part of this, Joash, the king of Israel, asked Elisha about how would there be victory in war over Syria? And Elisha said yes. And then he said to strike the arrows, and you might remember that I preached this sermon a couple of years ago about striking the arrows and not giving up too soon. But indeed, the king did not strike the arrows enough. He did give up too soon. And then Elisha dies. And you would think that would be the end of the miracles. But no. In fact, you might remember it was back in 2013 that I preached on this passage on Resurrection Sunday, because they had buried Elisha in a grave, and during a war, the marauders were coming through, and one of the men died, and the friends of this Israelite who had died, they threw the body, into Elisha's tomb, and when the body touched Elisha's body, he came back to life and started running again. So even in his death, at least there was one miracle. Now that's a lot of information to cover. 11, 12 chapters just in a few minutes. But the point of this quick survey of these episodes within the life of Elisha is to show that he really did some magnificent miracles. Remember, back in chapter 2, he had asked for a double portion of the Spirit that was within Elijah. And Bible scholars have tracked these things and have tried to show that Elisha did twice the number of miracles as Elijah. Elisha was extraordinary. So why am I preaching about this great miracle worker as the concluding message in a series on unsung heroes? It's a fair question. And my response goes back to the first message of this series before we knew who Elisha would become. Because remember, when we meet Elisha, he is working in a field as a farmer with 12 yoke of oxen. He is a farmer. He's a young man taking care of the field of his father with these animals. Again, he's a farmer. No more, no less. But God. God told Elijah to go find Elisha. Elijah was obedient. And he found Elisha. But what changed the life of Elisha was not that Elijah was obedient, but that Elisha was obedient in following Elijah. In other words, as I said earlier, Elijah's life changed when he chose to follow someone who was closely following God. But that wasn't all. Let's go back to the moment I said a few moments ago I'd return. Let's go back to the moment at the Jordan River. And let me read for us now 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. Beginning in verse 4, Elijah said to him, Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho. The sons of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? And he answered, yes, I know it. Keep quiet. Verse 6, then Elijah said to him, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. But he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water. And the water was parted to one side and to the other, till the two of them could go over on dry ground. In these verses, Elisha was tested twice. Twice, Elijah said to stay behind. Twice, Elisha did not stay behind. He said he wouldn't, and he didn't. Now, we don't know how much time passed between when Elijah had come to the farm and called Elisha. But Elisha chose to leave behind his parents, to leave behind that field, to leave behind his vocation to follow Elijah, and he was not about to stop at this point. But verse 5 now begins to indicate that at that point, once they reached Jericho, they were not alone. The sons of the prophets, so other prophets, not Elijah, not Elisha, but sons of other prophets, and there were 50 of them, came to talk to Elisha. They knew the will of God. Please understand, they knew the will of God. They said, do you not know that your master is going to be taken away today? And he was going to be taken away. And he was taken away. And so they knew what God was doing. These are not false prophets. They were accurate, at least in this moment, as to what was going to happen. Now, perhaps they were just merely trying to inform Elisha. Perhaps they were trying to dig a little bit like, hey, he's leaving. What are you going to do now? We don't know. We don't need to question their motive on that. But what we can know is that those 50 men decided to follow Elijah and Elisha from a distance. Notice verse 7. And the 50 men also went, as Elijah and Elisha went from Jericho to the Jordan, they also went, and then it says, and stood at some distance from them. When Elijah and Elisha were ready to cross the river, those men did not go. Notice verse 8. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water. And the water was parted to the one side and to the other till the two of them could go over on dry ground. The other 50 were watching from a distance. The two of them went over on dry ground. Do you know why Elisha received what he received? Do you know why Elisha was able to do all the things that he did? It's because he was willing to go a little extra. He was willing to do a little extra. He was willing to believe a little more. The sons of the prophets knew the will of God. They told Elisha what the will was, verse 5, but they were not willing to go the distance. Elisha was. And that is why he went from being a farmer to being a hero. Of course, again, his name is not as well known as many within the Bible, but it would be hard to call him an unsung hero. But the only difference between him and others is the role that God played in his life and the response that Elisha gave to that calling of God. Do you know why so many people miss out on being a hero? Do you know why so many people miss out on the things that God wants for them? The things that God wants to do through them? The answer is in our text today. They're not willing to go the distance. They're not willing to give a little extra. They're not willing to do a little more. That's really what separates the heroes of the Bible. The ones that we sing about and the ones that we don't sing about, those unsung heroes. That's really what separates them from everyone else. They were willing to give a little extra and do a little more. And as you've heard me say so many times, countless numbers of times in this series, the only difference between ordinary and extraordinary is a little extra. So have you missed your opportunity? No. Did you miss an opportunity? Sure, we all have. We've all missed opportunities in our life to do something for God. We may not have had that clear moment like when Elijah came and threw his cloak on top of Elisha, which was indicative of, it's time for you to follow. I am taking over for you. You have to leave your parents now. We may not have had that clarity, but we have all missed a moment. But have you missed your moment? Absolutely not. See, most people end up giving up because they believe they have missed their opportunity. But here's something that we must understand. Disciples are not just chosen in one moment. Disciples might be chosen at different moments and are made over the course of a lifetime. What do you mean by that, Andy? Well, in Jewish culture, especially during the time of Jesus, we know less about from the Old Testament, but there would have been a similar progression of thought at least. But the idea is during Jesus' time frame is that young boys would follow the rabbi. And at the age of 12, the rabbi would look to those young boys who had been following and say, you, and you, come follow me. And those that he did not pick, I'm not saying there were 5, I can't tell you the exact number, but for those that they did not pick, those other boys, this happened at the age of 12, they went back to their home, and most of them got involved in the family business in some way. 12 was the age of demarcation. If you were good enough, if you showed yourself worthy, then the rabbi might choose you in order to be his disciple. who did Jesus choose? Well, he chose people after they were 12. Was Jesus rabbi? Yes. He's even called rabbi. Teacher is what that means. But the boys like James and John, and like Peter and Andrew, these business partners together on the Sea of Galilee as fishermen, what were they doing? Well, we know James and John specifically were working with their father, Zebedee. They had gone back to the family business. Why? Now, we don't know the exact aspects of this. We don't know that they had been following a rabbi and had been rejected, but what we can deduce from the timing of all this and what we know of the culture from other resources is that they had missed their moment, supposedly. They had not been chosen by the rabbi to follow at age 12. And so they were back working. Had they missed an opportunity? Perhaps. Had they missed their opportunity? Not at all. Because Jesus was not concerned with whether they were worthy. Jesus was not concerned with whether they knew the right answers. Jesus invited them to come to follow Him, knowing that they had worth, knowing that they had value, and where they didn't believe that they had it, His investment into them proved that they had value. Their initial opportunity might have been gone, but Jesus helped them to realize their potential because He knew that their value wasn't what they were at age 12. It wasn't, you missed your moment at this age and you never have another chance, like so many young males in Israel who wanted to be a rabbi. No, Jesus knew that maybe they were 13, maybe they were 18, maybe they were somewhere in between. Jesus knew somebody like Nicodemus who was at least 50 years old. Jesus knew people who had been blind from birth for decades, had not missed their moment. Had they missed an opportunity? Maybe. Had they missed their opportunity? Absolutely not. And once they realized the opportunity that Jesus gave, they were willing to go. They were willing to give. They were willing to do a little more. A little extra. Just like Elisha. Remember, Elisha's life was changed when he chose to closely follow someone who was closely following God. The apostles' lives changed when they chose to follow someone, Jesus, who was closely following God, the Father. And that someone, Jesus, invites us to closely follow Him today. And He also invites us to follow others who will lead us to Him today as well. None of us may be known by the masses, but every one of us can be a hero to someone. If you are still here on this earth, if you can hear my voice, if you have life within your body at all, you have not missed your opportunity. You still have time to be a hero. You still have time to be successful. And the word success, from a biblical perspective, is a 5-letter word. F-A-I-T-H. Faith. For the believer, pleasing God should be considered the greatest goal that we have. And from God's perspective, from God's own word, faith is what makes us successful. Let me read from Hebrews 11:6, which says that by faith we bring pleasure to God. In Hebrews 11:6, and without faith, it is impossible to please Him. So the double negative, without, impossible. Therefore, with faith, it is possible to please Him. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So let me share a little acrostic that I've developed very recently as it relates to the idea of faith that can help us all to just give a little extra for the glory of God ultimately. Thinking about Hebrews 11, which says, by faith Abel offered, by faith Noah built, by faith Abraham went. There was a by faith and then there was a verb. By faith they did something. So here's the little acrostic. Faith requires action. It's not just I believe, it's belief that forces us to do, not forces, that causes us to do something. Faith requires action. That is obedience. Action requires intentionality. Again, as I've said so many times over these last couple of years, it's not that we have good intentions, it's that we are intentional. So action requires intentionality. Intentionality includes teaching. The Great Commission says, Jesus says, making disciples in one way, teaching others to observe all that I have commanded. What has he commanded? Requires obedience. So we are to teach obedience, teaching others to observe that. Teaching brings hope. And this is through the hope of the gospel. As Paul talks about, the hope of the good news of Jesus Christ. That is hope. Hope in the gospel. And hope increases faith. That is making disciples whose faith grows through this process. And as new disciples are made, they in turn go and make more disciples. So faith requires action. Action requires intentionality. Intentionality includes teaching. Teaching brings hope. And hope increases faith. So, let us have faith. Let us live by faith. And let us, like Elisha, give a little extra. Go a little extra. And let God be the one that chooses whether we are a hero to many or whether we are the hero to just one. Because ultimately, being a hero is not about being one for ourselves. It is being one for God and for his glory. Whether anyone knows, whether anyone else knows that we are a hero or not. Father, thank you for the example of someone like Elisha, but of the others that we've looked at, like family members such as Lois and Eunice, like nobodies such as Hathach, like the outcast, the demoniac, like the women of Hannah and Huldah that we looked at. So many different people, Lord, in just such a brief series, and so many others that are woven into Scripture that aren't the name that is most associated with your story. Like the great prophet Samuel, who wouldn't have been born if it hadn't been for the prayers of Hannah. God, these unsung heroes that most people don't know about, probably even fewer people care about. But God, their story is here for us. Because there's so few of us that are going to be the Paul or the Peter or the Moses or the Abraham. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a purpose for us. And Lord, it certainly does not mean that you are done with us, that we still have an opportunity to be a hero, even if it's just a one. So God, let us be obedient. Let us be willing to give that little extra. Not that we are extraordinary, but that our little extra ultimately will show that you are an extraordinary God, doing extraordinary things through us. God, thank you for these people. Let us appreciate them now. Let us thank them in eternity. Most importantly, Lord, let us thank you for our opportunity. Let us be obedient when that opportunity comes. And let us not just thank you, but to give praise to you and help other people know you for all that you've done, including what you've done for us. Most importantly, through the gift of your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.